Title: Whispers of the Unseen. Chapter 1: The Shadows Return. The house was silent, unnervingly so. It was the kind of silence that settled deep into your bones, like a presence, pressing in from all sides, waiting. The air was heavy with the weight of it, thick and unmoving, as if it had absorbed every whispered secret of those who had lived there before. Sam sat in the dim glow of the kitchen, the last remnants of his dinner, something quick and unsatisfying, left untouched on the table before him. He stared at the empty plate, his mind far from the meal, lost in the maze of his thoughts. It had been 3 days since he moved into the apartment. 3 days of constant unease gnawing at him from the shadows. There was something wrong here, something unseen. It whispered to him in the dead of night, always just out of reach, like the softest breath against his ear. He had dismissed it at first. After all, he was alone, just a man in a new city, trying to put distance between himself and the things that had once haunted him. But then it came again. That whisper, that sound like something barely human, something twisted. Sam. His name, spoken as if it was something more than just a word. A call, a summons. The whisper skittered down his spine like the fingers of a lover long forgotten. A forgotten lover who never left, whose presence was always there, waiting for the moment you thought you'd escaped. Sam had felt this before, years ago, when he was young. As a child, it was a constant companion. At the time, he had believed it was a bad dream, a figment of his imagination. But now, as an adult, with the weight of his experiences and the knowledge that some things were too real to ignore, he couldn't shake the feeling that the whisper was something far worse than a childish fantasy. He closed his eyes, tried to breathe, but the air was thick, heavy. He had done this to himself. Moving into this apartment, taking this job. He had told himself it was all a fresh start, a way to outrun the past. But now, in the quiet of this small, sterile apartment, that past crept up on him with all the subtlety of a predator stalking its prey. Sam reached for his phone, the dim light of the screen flickering to life as he unlocked it. A text message from his brother, one he hadn't answered in days. "Are you okay? Mum said she's worried." Sam's fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he tapped out a quick reply. Anything to stop the gnawing feeling in his chest. "I'm fine. Just tired. I'll call you later." His thumb hovered over the send button, but before he could hit it, the room seemed to shift. The temperature dropped, and a subtle pressure built against his chest. He looked around, feeling the air grow thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were watching him. The whisper came again, but this time it was louder, clearer. "Sam, I'm waiting." He dropped the phone onto the table, heart pounding in his chest, and stood up. The room felt smaller, the shadows creeping closer, curling into the corners like something alive. He swallowed hard, but his mouth had gone dry. It was here again, the thing that had haunted him when he was a child, the thing that had stalked him through every dark corner of his life, lurking in the edges of his memories, waiting for the right moment to return. Sam remembered it well, how it had started when he was 10 years old. The whispering voice, always just beyond his hearing, always pulling him toward the darkness. His parents had told him it was nothing, that children had wild imaginations, but he knew it was real. He had felt its eyes upon him, even in broad daylight, watching him, waiting for him to slip up, to fall into its trap. The dreams had come next, violent and disjointed, filled with twisted images of dark figures and long fingers that reached out from the shadows. He had begged his parents to get rid of it, to make it stop. But they had dismissed it, told him to grow up. And now, here it was again. Sam moved toward the bedroom, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath him. His hand trembled as he reached for the light switch. The soft glow of the light bulb flickered on, casting long shadows across the room. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the sense of unease that clung to him. But the room wasn't the same. Something was wrong. The window was open. He hadn't left it open. He hadn't been in here all evening. His heart skipped a beat as he stepped toward the window, The night was thick with fog, the streetlights outside casting a sickly yellow glow on the wet pavement. There was no sign of anyone, nothing but the eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. And yet, something moved in the corner of his eye. He turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. The closet door stood slightly ajar, the dark void within it seemingly deeper than it should have been. Sam knew for a fact he had closed it earlier. There was no reason for it to be open now. He hesitated, staring at the door, his feet rooted to the floor. The whispers were louder now, louder than ever before, and they seemed to be coming from the closet. Sam! The voice was unmistakable now, a soft, insidious hiss. I'm right here. He reached for the door, his hand shaking uncontrollably. No. He pulled the door open with a quick motion, expecting to find nothing. Empty clothes hanging from the rod. The usual detritus of his life. Books, shoes, old jackets. But instead, the closet seemed to stretch far deeper than it should have. And at the far end of the closet, just at the edge of his sight, something moved. A figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by the darkness. It was barely a silhouette, but Sam could feel its presence, a weight pressing in on him, like something long dead and forgotten had just awoken. His breath caught in his throat. His legs were shaking, but he couldn't look away. The thing in the closet had no eyes, yet it was looking directly at him. There was no sound, no movement, just the suffocating silence that thickened with every passing second. Sam. This time the whisper was not in his ears, it was inside his head. A voice too familiar, too intimate. It crawled through his thoughts like worms through dirt, filling every corner of his mind. He tried to move, to flee, but his feet were frozen in place. His body refused to obey him, every muscle locked in terror. The figure in the closet twitched, and Sam screamed, his voice ragged, wild. But the scream was swallowed by the silence, vanishing into the suffocating air. He closed his eyes, the darkness of the closet still vivid behind his eyelids. He could feel it, whatever it was, right behind him now. He could hear its breath, slow and steady, as if it were savoring his fear. It was waiting for him to turn around, waiting for him to look. And then, in the deepest corner of his mind, he remembered. He remembered the pact, his mother's whispered words, the warning she had given him as a child. Words he had long forgotten, but now echoed in the deepest reaches of his mind. You cannot escape. It will always follow you. The figure in the closet moved again, closer this time. Sam's knees buckled beneath him as the room seemed to close in around him, and the air grew thick, suffocating, the walls pressing in as if the house itself were alive. He finally tore his gaze away, running, stumbling out of the room, not daring to look behind him. But the whispers never stopped. They followed him, always, pulling at him like invisible threads, guiding him towards something he was too afraid to face. As Sam reached for the door, his breath coming in frantic gasps, he realized, with a sickening certainty, that he was not alone in this apartment. He never had been. This chapter sets the stage for the unfolding terror, building an atmosphere of dread and suspense. It hints at the protagonist's past, the presence that haunts him, and establishes a sense of inescapability. The writing style is meant to evoke a sense of creeping horror, with the unseen terror playing a significant role in the tone of the narrative. Chapter 2. The Fractured Mind. The next morning, Sam awoke in a cold sweat. His eyes shot open, heart pounding in his chest, the remnants of the nightmare still lingering like a fog in his mind. He could still feel the oppressive weight of the air in the apartment, the shadows in the corners stretching out to claim him. The whispering voice, too familiar, too close, was still echoing in the back of his skull, like a broken record that had no end. He lay in bed for a long time, staring up at the ceiling. The room was still. The sun, weak and grey through the windows, offered no comfort, only a dull light that seemed more like a warning than a relief. His breath was shallow, his body trembling, as if his skin still clung to the memory of whatever had been in that closet last night. It was just a dream, Sam tried to convince himself. Just a nightmare. But the part of him that knew better, the part that had seen these shadows before, couldn't shake the truth. It was real. Whatever it was, it had come back. Slowly, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet meeting the cold wooden floor with a soft thud. He stood, his body stiff and uncooperative, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled too tight. The room felt different now, smaller, the walls leaning in on him. Sam's gaze drifted to the corner by the closet, and for a split second, he thought he saw something move, a flicker of shadow that shouldn't have been there. But when he blinked, it was gone. He took a deep breath and turned away. He couldn't keep doing this. He couldn't keep questioning every shadow, every sound. He had to get a grip, to find some shred of normalcy again. He couldn't let whatever haunted him take root in his mind. He needed to go out, to face the world, to live in a way that didn't feel like a dream from which he would never wake. But when he reached for his phone to check the time, something caught his eye. The window. It was cracked open, the blinds gently swaying as if a breeze had just passed through. Sam froze. The window had been shut tight the night before. He was sure of it. He had checked it himself before going to bed, the weight of exhaustion pulling him into a restless sleep. A chill ran down his spine. The whispering voice returned in his mind, like a breath against the back of his neck. "Let me in." He shook his head violently, trying to dispel the thoughts that clung to him like a fog. The last thing he needed was to go deeper into this madness. He couldn't let it consume him again. He couldn't. But as he closed the window, a strange sensation washed over him. Something cold. Something ancient. It felt like something had been there. Something watching. He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear his head, but the feeling lingered, sinking into his bones. Sam quickly dressed, his movements mechanical, as if on autopilot. He didn't want to stay here any longer. He couldn't. The walls felt too close, the air too thick. With one last glance at the apartment, his apartment, he grabbed his keys and left, stepping out into the world that still felt like it belonged to someone else. For himself. The streets outside were damp with the remnants of a long-forgotten rain, the air thick with the scent of wet concrete and distant smoke. But the day was quiet, too quiet. No sounds of children playing, no cars honking in the distance, no birds in the trees, just the oppressive silence, thick and suffocating, that mirrored the world inside his mind. Sam's footsteps echoed unnervingly as he walked down the street, each step feeling more uncertain than the last. His eyes darted to every corner, every shadow, expecting to see something lurking, waiting. He could feel the weight of it all. The pressure, the anticipation. He was being followed. He knew it. He didn't have to turn around to know it. It was always there, just behind him, in the corner of his vision. Always watching, always waiting. He couldn't outrun it. He never could. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence in his head. He pulled it out, relieved for the distraction. It was a message from his boss. "Sam, need those reports by this afternoon. Please don't forget. If you need anything, let me know." He read the message twice, as if the words might suddenly make sense. He had forgotten. How had he forgotten? He had just started this job, just moved here, and now everything seemed out of place, out of sync, as if the world was turning around him while he remained stuck in place, unable to move forward. He typed a quick response. "I'll have them ready by noon." But as he hit send, a sudden cold gust of wind swept through the street, and Sam stopped in his tracks. The air around him seemed to distort, as if the very fabric of reality had bent for just a moment. He glanced around, but the street was empty. No one in sight, not a soul, a whisper. It was so faint at first, like a distant murmur from behind a wall. But then it grew louder, unmistakable. A voice, his name. "Sam!" He spun around but saw nothing. The street was empty, no one was there. He could feel his pulse racing, his breath quickening, as the world seemed to narrow around him. The buildings, the trees, the pavement, they all closed in, pressing down on him, suffocating him. "Sam!" The voice was closer now, so close that it felt like it was inside his head, inside his very soul. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to leave. He turned sharply, his feet moving faster than his thoughts. But the faster he moved, the more the whispers seemed to follow him, growing louder, more frantic. "Sam! Come back!" He stumbled down the street, trying to outrun the growing panic that clawed at his insides. The world felt like it was slipping away, unraveling thread by thread, until there was nothing left but the whispers. The apartment was a refuge, or so Sam thought. When he arrived back, the door creaked open with a sound that reverberated in his skull. He stepped inside, the cold air immediately filling his lungs. The apartment was unchanged, still and silent, as though the world outside had never existed, but something was different. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the space around him felt off. The shadows stretched longer than they should have, and the light, dim and pale, cast strange, unnatural angles on the walls. His eyes were drawn to the closet, as if it held something just beyond his sight, waiting, watching. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, the chill of the wood seeping into his skin. He needed to sit down, to collect himself. The day had been too much, too overwhelming. He made his way into the kitchen, but stopped short when he noticed the table. It was set. The dishes were arranged as if someone had been there, as if the meal had just been eaten. A half-empty glass of water sat in front of an empty chair. A faint scent of something sweet, something old, lingered in the air. Sam's heart skipped a beat, a cold shiver running through him. He was alone. He had been alone since he moved in. No one had come to visit him, not physically at least. And yet, there it was. The table set for two, the remnants of something that had never been there. His mind raced, but before he could even begin to make sense of it, the whisper returned. Stronger now, louder. "Sam, sit with me." The voice was unmistakable, a low, coaxing hiss that reverberated in his chest. His hands shook as he reached for the chair, his breath shallow, his mind reeling. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body wouldn't obey him. He was a puppet, strings tangled in some invisible force. He sat. The air in the room grew colder still, the shadows deeper, darker. The whisper swirled around him, wrapping around his thoughts like smoke. And then, the door creaked open again. This time, it wasn't the wind. This time, something was waiting on the other side. Chapter 2. The Fractured Mind, continued. The door creaked open with an agonizing slowness, the sound scraping against Sam's ears like 100 nails dragging across a chalkboard. His heart hammered in his chest as he sat motionless at the table, every nerve on edge, every fiber of his being screaming at him to run, to escape, but his legs refused to move. It was as if the apartment itself had him in its grasp, its grip tightening with each passing moment, each breath he took. The door was ajar just enough for a figure to stand in the doorway, the shape barely visible through the sliver of light that filtered through the dim room. Sam's breath caught in his throat as his eyes strained to focus on it. The figure was tall, slender, its form unnaturally thin. The edges of its silhouette blurred like a shadow stretched too far, its features indistinguishable, shrouded in a darkness that didn't belong in the room. For a long, unbearable moment, there was nothing but the silence between them. The whispering voice had stopped. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if time itself had frozen. Sam could feel his heartbeat in his ears, pounding, drumming, and then, in the deepest pit of his stomach, a sickening, icy fear began to spread, slowly, like poison. The figure didn't move. Sam's mind raced. He had to move, get up, run, leave, get out of here. But his body was frozen. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All he could do was stare at the figure in the doorway, waiting, dreading what would happen next. And then, it spoke. A low, guttural rasp, like the grinding of stone against stone, filled the air. It wasn't a voice. It was a sound, an unnatural, bone-chilling noise that made Sam's skin crawl. "Sam," the figure whispered again, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You've come back." The words were familiar, too familiar. His throat constricted as memories, forgotten, repressed, began to surface. jagged fragments of a past he had tried so desperately to bury. The voice that called his name, the voice that had haunted him before, the whispers in the dark. He had heard this before, hadn't he? Long ago when he was a child. But no, that was impossible. It was just a nightmare from the past. He shut his eyes, squeezing them tight, trying to block out the voice, the figure, the room that felt like it was closing in on him. But when he opened them again, the figure had moved. It was closer now, inches from him, its cold breath hitting his face like a winter storm. Sam recoiled, but still, his body wouldn't obey. It was as if invisible chains had bound him to the chair. The figure reached out a long, skeletal hand, its fingers so thin and pale that they almost seemed translucent. The air around them seemed to warp, to twist, as if reality itself were bending. The hand hovered near his face, then paused, its fingers trembling ever so slightly. "Do you remember?" The figure rasped, its voice more urgent now, but still as soft as a whisper. "Do you remember what you did?" The words sliced through him like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. His stomach churned and his pulse quickened. What did I do? His mind screamed in protest, but he couldn't remember. The memory was there, somewhere deep inside, but it eluded him, slipping just beyond his reach. No, 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 he thought, as the weight of the words pressed on him, crushing him under their sheer gravity. The figure's hand hovered closer, and in that instant, Sam saw it. A twisted, jagged smile stretched across the figure's face, its mouth too wide, the teeth sharp and uneven, gleaming in the dim light. The eyes. Sam's gaze darted downward. The figure's eyes were dark, empty, hollow. There was nothing but a void in them. And in that void, Sam saw something. His own face. A reflection. The figure let out a breath that smelled of decay, of rot. "We've been waiting for you." The room seemed to close in even tighter, the walls pressing in on him, the air suffocating. Sam's vision blurred, the room spinning, twisting around him as the figure's voice echoed in his head, louder, faster, relentless. "You left me behind, Sam." It was a jarring contradiction, familiar, yet foreign. He had heard these words before, but they didn't belong to him. They didn't belong to this place. His mind was unraveling. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, his skin clammy and cold. Who is this? What is this? He shook his head violently, trying to focus, trying to push the figure back, but it was as if the world itself had conspired to swallow him whole. The figure's hand reached out again, its fingers brushing his cheek, and the moment it touched him, Sam felt a jolt of cold rush through him, as if his very soul were being ripped from his body. "You abandoned me," the figure repeated, its voice now a low, guttural growl, like something that belonged to the depths of hell itself. "You left me behind, Sam, and now you will pay." Sam's vision went black. His body tensed, the world around him dissolving into nothingness. For a split second, he felt weightless, as if he were floating, suspended between two worlds. But then, the weight returned, heavier than before, the crushing pressure, the suffocating silence, and the whispering voice. "You can never leave." He tried to scream. He tried to call out for help, but no sound came. His lips moved, but the words were lost, swallowed by the darkness. When Sam opened his eyes again, he was back in the apartment. The chair was cold beneath him, the table before him still set, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The figure was gone. The air was still, but something was different. The shadows were deeper now, more insistent. The apartment no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a trap, a cage with invisible bars. The whispering voice was gone, but its presence lingered, like the echo of a scream that had never been heard. Sam's head throbbed, his thoughts swirling like a whirlwind. What had just happened? Was it real? A dream? His eyes darted to the closet, and for a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something moving inside. Just a shift in the darkness, a flicker of movement, like the breath of something waiting, something patient. No, he couldn't do this again. He couldn't. His hands trembled as he stood, his legs unsteady, and with one last glance around the room, he stepped toward the door. He had to leave. He had to get out of here. But as he reached for the handle, a soft sound stopped him. A laugh. Low. Quiet. Almost too quiet. It came from the closet. Chapter 3. The Return of the Forgotten. The morning after the encounter with the figure in the doorway, Sam woke to a silence so profound that it was almost oppressive. It was the kind of silence that presses against the ears, like the stillness before a storm. For a moment, he thought he had dreamed it all. The dark figure, the whispers, the suffocating cold that had gripped him. But then he saw the marks on his arms, tiny, raised lines that appeared overnight, like old scars resurfacing. As if his skin had been clawed at in his sleep, torn open by something that had left its impression on him. His fingers brushed over the lines, and the feeling that surged through him was not pain, but something darker, the unmistakable sensation of being touched. But by what? The thought was enough to send a tremor through him. Sam stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, his eyes bloodshot and wide. The man who stared back was a stranger, a man ravaged by terror, his face gaunt, hollowed by fear. His heart began to race again, the panic rising in his chest like bile, suffocating him. He clenched his fists, trying to steady his breathing. But the feeling of being watched, the sensation of something lurking just behind him, refused to go away. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He had to know what was happening. With a sudden, sharp resolve, Sam grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. His legs felt like lead, his every step heavy, as though the very air inside the apartment was thickening around him. The hallway outside was eerily quiet, the faint hum of the building's old electrical systems the only sound. But even the hum seemed wrong, out of place, like it was part of some mechanical creature, waiting to spring to life. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and Sam stepped inside, staring at the polished metal walls as the elevator began its descent. He had lived in this building for years now, but it had never felt this alien. The walls, once comforting, now loomed over him like silent, watching sentinels. The flickering light overhead cast long, exaggerated shadows on the floor, which seemed to stretch further with each passing second. "You're losing it," Sam told himself, shaking his head. "It's all in your mind. It has to be." But deep down, he knew it wasn't. This was real. The elevator stopped with a jolt, and the doors opened to the ground floor. As Sam stepped out, he felt the weight of the building's atmosphere pressing on him more heavily. Every face he passed seemed distant, their eyes glazed over, like they didn't belong to people, but to hollow shells. He wanted to ask them if they'd noticed anything strange, anything at all, but the words caught in his throat. What if they looked at him like he was crazy? What if I am crazy? He pushed the thought aside. Sam needed answers, and there was only one place that could give him the truth: the old library. It was a small, forgotten place near the edge of town, tucked away between crumbling brick buildings, overshadowed by a set of ancient trees that had long since surrendered to the passage of time. The kind of place no one ever went, a relic of a time when people read books for answers instead of staring into screens. As he walked down the narrow street leading to the library, Sam felt the familiar pull of something he couldn't quite explain. There was a heavy sense of déjà vu, a feeling that he had been here before, in another life, in another time. The streetlights flickered above him, casting strange shadows across the pavement. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, an earthy, musty smell that felt both comforting and ominous. When Sam reached the library, the door creaked open on its own. It wasn't unusual. The library had been abandoned for years, but today it felt different. It felt like it was waiting for him. He stepped inside, the heavy silence swallowing him whole. The air was stale, the shelves towering like ancient sentinels, holding books that had not been touched in decades. The dim light from the windows cast strange, elongated shadows that danced across the walls. The wooden floors groaned under his weight as he walked deeper into the room, his eyes scanning the endless rows of books. There had to be something here. Something to explain what was happening to him. Something to explain the figure, the whispers, the marks on his skin. At the far end of the room, nestled in the deepest corner, Sam noticed a small, unassuming book. It was old, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. But there was something about it, something that called to him. He approached it cautiously, as if afraid that picking it up might trigger something far worse than he could imagine. As his fingers brushed the spine of the book, he felt a sharp, sudden cold, like a gust of wind sweeping through him. It was the same sensation he had felt last night when the figure had reached out to him. He froze, his breath catching in his throat, but he couldn't pull his hand away. His fingers trembled as they turned the pages one by one, as if the book itself was guiding him to the information he so desperately sought. The text inside was written in an old, faded script, the letters looping and curling in ways that seemed unnatural. Sam could barely read it, but as he strained his eyes to make sense of the words, something began to form. Fragments of sentences, phrases that chilled him to the bone. You were never meant to escape. It has always been here. The darkness you left behind cannot be undone. You have broken the seal. Sam's heart skipped a beat. He recoiled, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just read. Broken the seal. What does that mean? He flipped back through the pages, searching frantically for more answers, more clues to explain what was happening to him. The further he read, the more the words seemed to bleed together, the ink smudging, as if the book were alive, reacting to his touch. Suddenly, his hand shot back. He felt something cold and clammy brush against his fingers. He looked down. For a brief, fleeting moment, he thought he saw a face staring up at him from the pages. Hollow eyes, a smile that was not a smile but a gaping, empty void. No. He slammed the book shut, his breath ragged, his mind spinning. He couldn't breathe. The walls of the library seemed to close in around him, the space shrinking, the air thickening like tar. You've opened it, Sam. The voice came from nowhere, and everywhere. It filled his mind, reverberating through the very core of his being, distorting his thoughts, twisting his perception of reality. He spun around, but the library was empty. No one was there, yet the voice continued to echo, louder now, growing closer. It was never meant to be opened. Sam's legs buckled beneath him. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his head as the weight of the revelation pressed down on him. The world around him felt like it was breaking apart. The whispers, no, the voices grew louder, more insistent. The figure, the thing in the doorway, it's all connected. In his frantic desperation, he reached for the book again, but when his fingers brushed the cover, a sharp pain shot through his arm. He pulled back, looking down to find fresh cuts appearing on his skin. Deep, jagged marks, as if something had sliced through him. And then, in the blink of an eye, the marks healed, vanishing completely, leaving no trace behind. It was the book. The book was doing this to him. He had to destroy it. But as he scrambled to his feet, he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, methodical, coming from the far end of the library. Heavy, unyielding. Sam turned toward the sound, his pulse racing, his mouth dry. A figure emerged from the shadows at the back of the room. It was the same figure from his apartment, and it was smiling. Chapter 4. The whispers in the dark. The coldness in the air intensified as Sam stumbled back from the figure that had appeared before him. His mind reeled with disbelief. How could it be here? How is this possible? The thing that had haunted his apartment, the shadow in the doorway, was now standing before him in the flesh, or something resembling it. Sam's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he took an instinctive step backward. The library around him felt smaller, more suffocating by the second, as if the very space had begun to close in on him. The figure's face was featureless, at least it should have been. The air shimmered in front of him, like a heat wave, and then, as if emerging from the folds of reality itself, the figure's face became visible. It was hollow, not empty, not devoid of expression, but hollow, as if something had been carved out of it, leaving a grotesque void that only mimicked the shape of a human face. The eyes, dark and unblinking, seemed to drink in the very light, drawing it into the abyss of its gaze. The mouth, stretched wide, pulled at the edges like it was always grinning, except that Sam knew it wasn't a grin. It was the empty mockery of one. The figure took a step toward him. Its movements were deliberate, unhurried, like it had all the time in the world, and Sam, with his back pressed against the nearest bookshelf, realized that he couldn't move. His legs were rooted to the floor, his body stiffened in place by an unseen force. A suffocating pressure clung to his chest, as if his very lungs were being crushed by an invisible hand. "You've opened it," the voice whispered again. But this time it was not just in his ears. The words echoed in his mind, louder, as if they were carved into the very fabric of his thoughts. "The seal is broken. There is no going back." Sam's hands trembled as he reached for the book, but it felt as though his fingers were no longer his own. They moved slowly, almost against his will, as if he were watching himself from afar, a spectator in his own body. The book had grown heavier in his hands, its pages now filled with symbols and languages he could barely understand. Each word felt like a curse, seeping into him like poison. "No!" Sam choked out, trying to force the words past the lump in his throat. I didn't mean to." The figure tilted its head to the side, a slow, calculated motion. "You never mean to," it hissed. "But you do. You always do." The pressure in the room thickened, like the walls themselves were breathing. Inhale, exhale. The shelves trembled, their old wood creaking in protest as if they were alive, as if they too were bound by some ancient law that Sam had inadvertently set into motion. His pulse pounded in his ears, the beating of his heart matching the rhythm of the air around him. "Why are you doing this?" Sam whispered, barely able to speak, the terror suffocating his voice. "Doing this?" The figure's lips pulled into a twisted smile, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. It seemed to savor the question, as if it found amusement in Sam's fear. "I'm not doing anything. I'm here because you called me. You brought me into this world." The figure's voice was a low, guttural whisper that reverberated through Sam's bones, sending chills down his spine. His stomach twisted, and he fought against the wave of nausea threatening to overwhelm him. "No," he muttered again, his voice a broken echo. "No, I didn't." "You did," the figure said, its grin never faltering. "You are the one who sought the truth, and now you will pay the price." Suddenly, the figure was right there, inches away from him. Its presence was suffocating, a weight pressing against him like the sky had fallen and crushed the world beneath it. Sam could feel the cold radiating from it, a biting frost that seeped into his skin, down to his bones. He tried to pull away, but his body wouldn't obey him. He was trapped. With one swift movement, the figure reached out and grabbed the book from his hands. Sam felt an electric shock run through him as it touched the leather cover, the skin of his palms burning where the figure's fingers had brushed him. The book was pulled away, and Sam felt a desperate need to stop it from being opened. But there was nothing he could do, nothing but watch as the figure flipped open the pages with a casual ease that made Sam's stomach turn. The figure's gaze flickered across the pages, reading words that Sam couldn't decipher. The air around them seemed to hum, like 1,000 voices whispering from the void, voices that should not exist. The pages fluttered faster, and the room began to warp, the walls distorting, as if reality itself were bending under the pressure of something ancient and incomprehensible. The figure spoke again, its voice so soft that Sam had to strain to hear it, but each word cut through him like a blade. "This is how it begins," the figure intoned, its voice a sickening lullaby. "The world will crack, and the veil will fall. You will see what was hidden, and in that moment, you will understand. But by then, it will be too late." Sam's vision blurred. He blinked, trying to shake himself free of the heavy fog that had descended upon him. But it was no use. The library, the books, the figure, it all felt unreal, like he was being sucked into a dream from which he couldn't wake. "No, this isn't real," Sam whispered, his voice barely audible. "It can't be real." The figure paused, its head tilting again in that unnerving, calculating way. Then it spoke again, its voice laced with mock sympathy. "Is that what you think? That you can wake up? That this is all just a dream?" It stepped closer, so close now that Sam could feel the cold seeping through his clothes, his skin. "You opened the door, Sam. Now you will walk through it. There's no waking up from this." Sam's heart skipped a beat. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the figure, and then, for the briefest of moments, the figure's face shifted. The hollow emptiness remained, but now there was a flicker, an image, something alive that passed across its expression like a shadow crossing the moon. A memory, a flash of something Sam didn't recognize, but it was enough to make him take a step back. The figure's grin widened, as if it knew exactly what Sam was thinking. "Do you remember me, Sam?" it asked, its voice a low, mocking whisper. "You should. You and I were once close." The words struck him like a blow. His mind spun, trying to make sense of what the figure was saying, but the more he thought, the more his memories seemed to twist and fragment. He knew that voice, that presence. It was familiar, but it was impossible. He couldn't remember who it was. The figure reached out, its cold fingers grazing Sam's cheek, and the touch sent a shock through him, searing through his skin. "You don't recognize me yet," it whispered, "but you will. Soon enough." Sam's breath caught in his throat as he stepped back, his legs shaking beneath him. He didn't know what it meant. He didn't know what it wanted. But he knew one thing for certain. The figure, whatever it was not just a manifestation of his fear. It was something older, something deeper, and it was tied to him, bound to him in ways he couldn't begin to understand. The figure raised the book higher, and Sam's heart raced, the fear twisting in his gut. The pages fluttered again, faster now, until they stopped on a page that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. "Look," the figure said, its voice now a hiss, a rasp of something ancient and terrible. "This is where it all begins." And then, in the deepest silence of the room, the figure's eyes locked with Sam's. "You will never leave this place. Not now. Not ever." And the darkness that surrounded them thickened, swallowing everything. Chapter 5. The Burden of Knowledge. The air in the library grew heavier as Sam tried to back away from the figure, but his legs refused to cooperate. He could feel the cold creeping through his veins, settling into the marrow of his bones, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Every step back felt like he was sinking deeper into quicksand, his limbs sluggish, his heart pounding louder in his chest than ever before. He wanted to run, he wanted to scream. But something inside of him, the same part of him that had opened the book, the same part of him that had crossed the line between the known and the unknown, held him there, helpless. The words the figure had spoken echoed in his mind like a curse that he couldn't escape. "You will never leave this place. Not now. Not ever." The figure's hollow eyes watched him, unblinking, as it flipped through the pages of the book. Sam's gaze followed the motion, unwillingly drawn to the text that had started all of this, the text that had dragged him into the dark void of the unknown. Each page was filled with strange symbols, twisted runes, and writing in a language he couldn't even begin to comprehend. The more he looked at it, the more the words seemed to twist and writhe like living things, shifting before his eyes. It was as if the book itself was alive, feeding on his fear, growing stronger with each breath he took. The sensation was suffocating. Like an invisible hand was wrapped around his throat, tightening with every second that passed. The figure's voice broke through his reverie, soft and cruel, like the whisper of a dream that should never be remembered. "It's all right, Sam," it said, its lips stretching into that grotesque, mocking grin. "You wanted to know. You wanted the truth. And now you will see." Sam's heart skipped a beat, his stomach lurching with terror. The figure was no longer a stranger, not just some manifestation of his fear. There was something familiar about it, something in its presence that gnawed at the edges of his memories. It was like a dream just out of reach, a face that he knew but couldn't name. His mind flashed back to the years before, to his childhood home, to the dusty old attic that had always been off limits. The books, the strange symbols. He remembered now. It was there that he had found his first glimpse of the supernatural, buried beneath piles of forgotten things. It had been an accident, of course. He had just been a child, curious, alone, searching for something he shouldn't have. But that moment, when he had opened the old leather-bound book, had set something in motion. He had awakened something he wasn't supposed to, and it had followed him ever since, waiting for the right time to strike. "Do you remember now?" the figure asked, its voice like the scratch of nails on a chalkboard. "The attic, the book, the promises you made to yourself. You thought you could forget, but you can't. You can never forget." Sam's blood ran cold. The memory hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment his mind reeled with the weight of it. He had thought it was just a dream, a fleeting thing from his childhood that had long since passed. But it wasn't. It had been real, and now it had come for him. "No," Sam gasped, shaking his head, trying to push the figure away. I didn't want this. I never wanted this." The figure leaned in, its face inches from his, the air around it warping and shimmering with an unnatural chill. Its eyes were vast, dark, hollow, like the void itself, like the infinite darkness between the stars. "You've been wanting it for years," it whispered. "You just didn't know it, but now you do." The figure lifted the book higher, its pages fluttering with a life of their own. Sam's eyes were drawn to the pages once again, even though every fibre of his being screamed at him to look away. The text twisted and writhed in the air, a mixture of symbols that seemed to take on a form of their own, like they were reaching out to him. "You wanted to understand," the figure continued. "You wanted to know the truth. But the truth, Sam, the truth is never kind." Suddenly, the pages stopped turning, and the figure's fingers hovered over one particular passage. It was written in a language Sam couldn't understand, but somehow he could feel the weight of the words, pressing down on him like a burden that had been carried for centuries. The figure smiled again, its lips curling into that horrible grin. "This is the moment you've been waiting for, the moment when everything changes." Without warning, the figure slammed the book shut, and the room seemed to shudder. The shelves rattled, the air thickened, and Sam's vision blurred. His mind reeled as the book's energy crackled through the room, sending waves of nausea coursing through his body. Then came the whispers. At first they were faint, like distant murmurs, but they quickly grew louder, voices speaking in a language Sam couldn't recognize. The words weren't just in his ears, they were inside his mind, clawing at his thoughts, digging into his consciousness. Each whisper carried with it an unbearable weight, as if 1,000 voices were begging him to listen, to understand, to remember. Sam's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, his hands clutching his head as the whispers grew louder and more insistent. The voices filled every crevice of his mind, twisting his thoughts into something unrecognizable. "You are the one. You are the key. You opened the door." Sam screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the overwhelming noise of the voices. He couldn't hear his own thoughts, couldn't escape the suffocating presence that surrounded him. The library seemed to stretch on forever, the shelves growing taller and taller, the walls warping like they were breathing. And through it all, the figure stood watching him with that twisted grin. "You wanted to know the truth," it said again, its voice now a low, reverberating hum. "And now you do. But be careful what you wish for, Sam. Truth is a poison. Once you drink it, there is no coming back." The floor beneath him seemed to crack open, the ground trembling as though something deep beneath it was stirring. The whispers, the voices, they were coming from somewhere, from some place deep within the earth, from the very core of reality itself. Sam felt a coldness seep into his bones, as if the world around him was collapsing, as if the fabric of reality was unraveling at the seams. "You will never be the same," the figure whispered, leaning close again, its breath like ice against his skin. "You've opened the door, and now you must walk through it." Sam struggled to push the figure away, but his arms were heavy, like lead, and his body felt as though it were no longer his own. He wanted to scream, to fight, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by the weight of everything he had learned. The whispers grew louder, the voices calling to him from the depths of the abyss, and Sam knew, with a sickening certainty, that there was no way out. Chapter 5. The Burden of Knowledge continued. The The suffocating atmosphere of the library closed in around Sam like a vice. The whispers continued to crawl through his mind, slithering like snakes over his thoughts, twisting them into something unnatural. He couldn't escape them. No matter how much he tried to block them out, no matter how hard he clutched his ears and squeezed his eyes shut, they were always there. Inside him, around him, pressing against him from all directions. "You will never leave this place," the figure murmured again, its voice like the grinding of ancient stone. "Not now. Not ever." Sam's mind raced, searching for an escape, any escape, but it was as if the very fabric of reality had been shredded, leaving only the overwhelming presence of the figure and the book. His chest tightened with a primal fear, the kind that clawed at the edges of his sanity and threatened to drown him in a sea of madness. The book had done this. He had known it all along, even before he opened it, even before he stumbled into this cursed place. There was a price for knowledge, a price for understanding things that were never meant to be understood. But Sam had been too curious, too eager to uncover the hidden truths of the universe, to see beyond the veil. Now, he was paying the price. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring every moment of Sam's torment. It reached down and placed a hand on the book, running its fingers over the cracked ancient cover. The air around them seemed to thrum with energy, like the book itself was alive, pulsing with the power of an ancient, forgotten force. "You've opened it," the figure said softly. "You've called forth what was hidden, what was buried for a reason. You wanted to know, Sam, but you never thought about the consequences, did you?" Sam's breath came in shallow gasps, his heart hammering in his chest. His body felt as if it were breaking under the pressure, as if the weight of his own curiosity was crushing him from the inside out. The whispers had become louder now, louder than ever before, filling his mind with a cacophony of voices that seemed to grow in volume with every passing second. He clutched at his head, desperate to silence them, to make them stop, but it was no use. The voices were endless. "You are the key. You are the chosen one. The world will change because of you." Sam squeezed his eyes shut, fighting back tears of frustration. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to get out. He had to find a way to end this madness. But as his mind spiraled, something within him began to shift. A strange clarity settled over him, cold and unfeeling, like the embrace of death itself. The whispers had started to make sense, each word falling into place like a puzzle piece he hadn't realized he'd been assembling. And with the clarity came the truth that was more terrifying than anything he could have imagined. The book wasn't just a book. It was a doorway, and Sam was the one who had opened it. The figure, watching him with its empty, soulless eyes, seemed to sense the shift in Sam's demeanor. A grin stretched across its lips, twisted and inhuman, as if it knew the terrible revelation that had just dawned upon him. "Do you understand now?" the figure whispered. "The door you've opened isn't just a door to knowledge. It's a door to everything. The past, the future, the realms that exist outside of time and space. You've invited them in. You've made yourself a part of their world. And now, you belong to them." The air grew colder. The shadows around them deepened, pressing in from all sides. The shelves, once filled with endless rows of books, now seemed to stretch endlessly upward, as if they were towering into an abyss that was beyond human comprehension. The very walls of the library seemed to tremble with the weight of unseen forces moving within. Sam stood frozen, his mind reeling from the figure's words. He had always thought that knowledge was power, that by uncovering the truth, he could control it, shape it to his will. But now he understood. The truth had never been his to control. It had always controlled him, waiting for the moment when he would be weak enough, foolish enough, to open the door. And now, that door had opened. The figure took a step closer, and Sam instinctively stepped back, his heart racing, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and terror. But his back hit something solid. Another bookshelf. He couldn't retreat any farther. "It's too late to run now," the figure said softly, its voice almost a caress. "You wanted to know what was behind the veil, and now you'll see it all." The figure raised a hand, and the book opened once again, its pages fluttering with an unnatural wind. Sam's gaze was drawn to it, despite every instinct telling him to look away. His mind seemed to be pulling him toward the words on the page, even though he could barely understand them. But there, in the center of the page, were symbols unlike anything he had seen before. They were not merely written, they were alive, moving, shifting in the air, like they were reaching out to touch him. The figure's hand moved slowly, tracing the symbols in the air, and with each motion, the very air around Sam seemed to warp. Reality itself bent, twisted, and broke. The whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else until they were the only thing left. And then it happened. The ground beneath Sam's feet cracked open with a deafening roar, and the walls of the library shattered like glass, sending shards of ancient wood and stone scattering into the air. The book, the source of all of this, floated before him, its pages turning faster and faster as the room dissolved around him. He was no longer in the library. He was somewhere else entirely. The air was thick and oppressive, like a storm that was waiting to break. Sam could feel something, someone watching him, and when he looked around, he saw it. A figure standing in the distance, a silhouette against an endless, swirling void. The figure was tall, impossibly so, and its face was obscured by shadow, but Sam could feel its gaze piercing through him, seeing him for what he truly was. The whispers died down, leaving only a silence that was more suffocating than anything Sam had ever felt. His heart hammered in his chest, and for a brief moment, he was convinced he was going to die. And then, the figure spoke, its voice deep and ancient, like the rumble of thunder across the sky. "You have opened the door, Sam." The words struck him like a blow, and for a moment he lost all sense of himself. Everything he had known, his past, his memories, his very sense of reality, faded away, leaving only the presence of the figure and the overwhelming weight of the truth. And then, just as quickly, the figure was gone, leaving Sam alone in the vast emptiness. But he wasn't alone. Not really. The whispers returned, louder than before, and Sam realized, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, that they would never stop. Not ever. Chapter 6. The echoes of the forgotten Sam woke, but the world around him did not. Or perhaps he had woken in a place where the world no longer followed the rules of time. The air was thick, like the inside of a tomb, stale and unbreathing, and yet it clung to him, chilling his skin in a way that felt wrong. As his eyes opened, the first thing he saw was the emptiness, the vast, oppressive emptiness that stretched out before him in every direction, as far as the eye could see. He tried to speak, but no sound came from his throat. No air filled his lungs. The silence pressed in on him from all sides, wrapping around his chest like iron chains. His breath hitched in his chest, but even as his panic rose, he understood, with a clarity that cut through the fog of his fear, that this was no ordinary silence. It was the kind of silence that existed in places where no life had ever been, where no sound had ever dared to disturb the deep and eternal quiet. And yet, Sam could feel them, the presence, the eyes, the watchers who had been there since the beginning of time. He forced his legs to move, one step, then another, his feet carrying him through the cold nothingness. His mind screamed for answers, for understanding, but every thought was drowned in the overwhelming sensation of being watched, of being observed by something ancient, something beyond the limits of human comprehension. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them. He could sense their presence, crawling across his skin like 1,000 invisible fingers. "Where am I?" Sam whispered into the void, but the words died in his throat, swallowed by the silence before they ever reached his ears. Then, a movement caught his eye, a flicker in the distance. At first, he thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him, a hallucination brought on by fear, but it wasn't. It was real. The shape was shifting, bending, and within it, Sam saw glimpses of something familiar, a reflection of something he knew but couldn't place. The figure twisted and warped, like a distorted memory. No, more than that. It was like a part of him, a part of his own forgotten self, manifesting in front of him. Without thinking, he began to walk toward it, each step slow and deliberate, as if his body was too afraid to rush. The closer he got, the clearer the shape became. It was a figure, humanoid, but its features were blurred, indistinct, like a shadow that could not decide what form it wished to take. The more Sam stared at it, the more the figure seemed to pull at something deep inside of him. A memory that had long since faded, a place he had once known. "Who are you?" Sam asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure did not respond with words, but instead it moved, sliding across the barren landscape like it was swimming through the air. It was pulling him in, drawing him toward it with a force that Sam couldn't resist, no matter how much he wanted to. The closer he got, the more he could feel it. The pressure building in his chest, the weight of something unnameable pressing against him, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, just as he reached out to touch the figure, it vanished, dissolving into thin air like smoke in the wind. Sam stumbled forward, his heart racing in his chest. He blinked, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no time to think. The ground beneath him began to tremble, a low rumble rising from the very depths of the void, shaking the air like a distant thunderclap. In the distance, something else appeared. At first, it was only a shadow, but as it grew closer, Sam could see it more clearly. A doorway, standing alone in the middle of the empty wasteland. The doorway seemed out of place, an unnatural structure in this forsaken land. It was tall and narrow, framed by ancient, gnarled stone that seemed to hum with a strange energy. The very sight of it made Sam's skin crawl, but at the same time, he was drawn to it, as if it held the answers he so desperately sought. Without thinking, he moved toward it. His footsteps echoed through the silence, each one louder than the last, as if the ground itself was amplifying his every movement. The doorway loomed larger with every step, its edges growing sharper, more defined, as though it were pulling the world around it into focus. As Sam reached the threshold, he hesitated. The darkness beyond the door was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. But the whispers, they were back. Soft at first, like a murmur on the edge of his hearing, but then growing louder, more insistent. He couldn't make out the words, but he could feel them. They were calling to him, beckoning him forward, urging him to step inside. And then, without a second thought, Sam stepped through the door. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the world around him exploded in a burst of light. He stumbled forward, his body disoriented as the light surrounded him, enveloping him in a searing brightness that burned through his closed eyelids. He gasped for breath, his lungs filling with air that felt both foreign and familiar, like something from a forgotten dream. When the light finally faded, Sam found himself standing in a new place. No, not a place, but an experience. It was as if he had been ripped from one reality and thrown into another, one that was both terrifying and magnificent in its scope. The sky above him was a swirling mass of colors, like oil on water, constantly shifting and changing, as if the very fabric of the universe was in flux. The ground beneath his feet was soft and spongy, as though it were alive, breathing in rhythm with his own heartbeat. Strange, twisted trees stretched up toward the sky, their branches curled like the fingers of some great, slumbering beast. And in the distance, Sam could see something moving, something large, something that made his stomach twist with a primal sense of fear. But the most unsettling part of this new world was the silence. It was the same suffocating silence from before, but now it had a presence. It felt like something was watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. He was not alone, not truly. There were eyes here, eyes in the shadows, in the very air itself. And somewhere in the distance, something was waiting for him. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he forced his legs to move. Every instinct told him to run, to turn back and escape the void he had stepped into, but his feet wouldn't obey. He had opened the door, and now there was no turning back. Ahead of him, in the center of the strange alien landscape, there was a figure. No, a presence. It was too large, too vast to be human, but its shape was undeniably humanoid. Its form shimmered in the shifting light, like a mirage that kept slipping in and out of focus. And as Sam looked at it, he felt a sickening familiarity. He had seen this figure before, in his dreams, In the depths of his memory, a voice that was not his own, whispered in his mind, calling out to him from the depths of this strange place. "Welcome, Sam. Welcome to the place between worlds." The voice was soft, soothing, but there was something cold about it. Something that made Sam's skin crawl. The figure moved, its shape bending and twisting like liquid. And then, for the briefest moment, Sam saw its face. A face like his own, but twisted, broken, decayed. The world around him shifted again, the ground beneath him trembling as the presence drew closer. "You sought the truth, Sam, but truth, like all things, has a price." Sam's heart raced in his chest as he tried to take a step back, but his body wouldn't obey. The figure was there, right in front of him now, its face an impossible reflection of his own. And in the hollow eyes that stared back at him, Sam saw something that chilled him to the bone. Something that he could never escape, no matter how hard he tried. The truth. "You will never leave this place, Sam. You have opened the door, and now you will stay." The figure's voice echoed around him, and Sam realized, with a horrifying certainty, that it was not speaking to him alone. It was speaking for them. The eyes that watched, the voices that whispered, the ancient forces that had always been here, waiting for him. And as the world around him began to crumble, Sam understood that there would be no escape. Not now, not ever. Chapter 7. The Tapestry of Fate. The air was no longer still, but filled with a strange hum, vibrating beneath the surface of Sam's skin. It was like the world was alive with secrets, whispering them into the cracks of his mind. Secrets he wasn't ready to know. The figure that had appeared before him, that mirrored his own reflection in the grotesque and decayed form, seemed to dissolve with the words it spoke, slipping into the emptiness like smoke in a windless night. Yet, Sam knew, deep down, that it had not truly gone. It lingered, somewhere just beyond the edges of his perception, waiting. His heart thudded in his chest, the frantic beat reverberating through his entire body. The ground, still pulsing with unnatural energy, seemed to shift beneath his feet, as if the world was rearranging itself. The strange landscape that surrounded him, the trees twisted and bloated, the sky swirling with colors that shouldn't exist, felt less like a place and more like a state, a plane of being that existed outside of time and reality. And as he stood there, rooted in the heart of this otherworldly place, he realized that he wasn't alone. There was something here with him, something that had always been here. Sam closed his eyes for a moment, the overwhelming weight of the situation pressing down on him like a vice. When he opened them again, the landscape had changed, though it was still the same distorted world. The sky had darkened, and the air felt thicker, like it was saturated with something intangible, yet suffocating. He started walking, but each step seemed to take him farther from his destination. With every turn, the landscape shifted. The trees bent toward him, their branches twisting like fingers, their leaves whispering in a language he couldn't understand. He reached out, touching the trunk of one tree. The bark was slick, and as his fingers brushed over it, a strange vision flashed before his eyes, a series of fragmented images, too rapid to comprehend, but clear enough to feel. Faces, eyes, whispers. He pulled his hand back, his breath ragged, the air suddenly choking him. No, he thought, I can't let myself be lost in this place. He shook his head, trying to rid himself of the unsettling images that clung to his mind. The presence of the figure lingered, ever watchful. He had the distinct feeling that, whatever he did, it was never far away, just out of sight, just behind him, waiting for the moment when he would slip and fall into its grasp. Sam pressed forward, not knowing where he was headed, but certain that there was something he needed to find, something buried deep within the twisted fabric of this place. The truth, the voice had said. But what truth could there possibly be in a land so broken, so far removed from anything Sam had ever known? The answer, as elusive as it was, began to take shape in the periphery of his vision. like a flicker of light in the distance. He squinted into the darkening horizon, where he saw what appeared to be a structure, an altar perhaps, or a building of some kind, though it was difficult to make out its shape through the shifting colors of the sky. There was something there, something waiting. He moved toward it, his steps quickening despite the sinking feeling in his stomach. With every step, the whispers grew louder, voices too faint to understand, yet unmistakably insistent. They filled his ears, crowded his thoughts, and, like the constant hum of the air, became a part of him, vibrating in sync with the rhythm of his pulse. The landscape seemed to constrict around him as he neared the structure. The trees, those twisted, gnarled things, had become fewer, their forms thinning out as he drew closer to the center of this realm. Finally, the structure came into full view, its grotesque, decaying form becoming clear against the swirling backdrop. It was a building of sorts, but it was no earthly architecture Sam had ever seen before. The stone that made it up was blackened, charred as if it had been burned by an inferno that had long since consumed everything around it. Vines and thorns twisted up its sides, and strange symbols were carved into the walls, their meaning lost to time. He stopped at the entrance, a gaping archway leading into darkness. Sam hesitated. Something was pulling him forward, but at the same time, a warning echoed through the back of his mind, a primal fear that told him to turn away, to leave this place before it consumed him. But the whispers, those voices, were louder now, echoing from within, like 1,000 pleading souls. Their desperation reached into his chest, clawing at his heart, urging him to step inside. His hand reached out before he could stop it, brushing the stone of the arch. The moment his fingers made contact, the ground shook, and the air grew thick with static, crackling and humming like the energy before a lightning strike. A low growl reverberated from deep within the earth, a sound so ancient it rattled his bones. Without thinking, Sam crossed the threshold. Inside, the space was not empty, but neither was it filled with anything that Sam could understand. The walls seemed to close in around him as he stepped further in, the shadows growing deeper and more oppressive. The air was dense, thick with the scent of decay, of long-forgotten things. The whispers from outside had ceased, replaced by a deep silence that felt as suffocating as a tomb. The room stretched before him, impossibly large for such a decayed structure, its ceiling lost in the shadows. At the center of the room was a pedestal, made of the same blackened stone as the walls, its surface worn and cracked. On it rested a book, ancient and heavy, its pages yellowed with age and its cover covered in strange, indecipherable symbols. Sam moved toward it, drawn by an undeniable compulsion. His hand hovered over the book, trembling, before he finally touched the cover. The moment his fingers made contact with it, the room seemed to exhale, and the whispers returned, louder than before, swirling around him like a storm. His heart raced in his chest, but he couldn't stop. He had to open it. The book creaked open as if it had not been touched in centuries. The pages seemed to turn on their own, fluttering as though caught in a wind that Sam could not feel. And then, the words, those strange symbols, shifted before his eyes, rearranging themselves into something he could read. The message was clear. "This is the beginning of your end, Sam." The words burned into his mind, searing themselves into the fabric of his thoughts. He staggered back, the book slipping from his grasp and falling to the ground with a thud. The whispers grew louder, rising to a crescendo until they became a deafening roar, a cacophony of voices that seemed to speak with one mind. Sam clutched his head, his vision blurring as the room spun around him. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching toward him like tendrils. He could feel them, those eyes again, watching from every corner of the room, pressing in on him, suffocating him. And then, a figure appeared before him. Not the distorted one he had seen earlier, but something different, something more human. It was a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, as though she had been drained of all light. Her hair was long and black, falling around her face like a curtain, and her mouth twisted into a smile that was as cold and empty as the abyss. "You are here," she whispered, her voice like the scraping of nails on a chalkboard. "You have finally come to accept your fate." Sam recoiled, his body trembling. No, no, this isn't real. This can't be real. The woman's smile widened, her expression almost pitying. You think you can escape? You've been brought here for a reason. All paths lead to this. A wave of dizziness washed over Sam. The room seemed to blur, the shadows reaching out to swallow him whole. He could no longer tell where the woman ended and the darkness began, her form blending with the very air around her. There is no escape, Sam. You cannot undo what has been done. You opened the door, and now you must walk the path it has set for you. The ground beneath Sam's feet cracked open, and in that moment, the truth hit him like a physical blow. There is no escape. The woman's cold, lifeless eyes bore into his soul as the world collapsed around him. He wanted to scream, but no sound came. He wanted to run, but his body refused to move. The room, the world, everything faded to black, and Sam was left with only the echoes of his name, whispered over and over, a final reminder of the fate he could never escape. Chapter 8. The Unraveling. The air was heavy, oppressive, and thick with the scent of damp earth, stale wood, and something else. A smell Sam couldn't quite place, though it reminded him of death, decay, the slow erosion of time itself. It clung to him, suffocating, filling his lungs with each desperate breath he tried to take. His skin felt raw, exposed to the cold of the ancient walls that surrounded him. His fingers trembled as they brushed against the stone beneath his palms, but it was not the chill that made him shake. No, the tremors came from something deeper, from the very marrow of his bones. The room was silent now, save for the faint dripping of water, echoing through the vast cavernous space. The echoes seemed to distort, stretching out into the dark corners, amplifying into something more, something sinister. The darkness itself felt alive, as if the shadows were watching, shifting and breathing as though they had a will of their own. Sam could feel the walls closing in on him, the oppressive weight of time pressing down harder with each passing second. It was as though the very air around him was tightening, constricting, like the noose of fate was being drawn ever so slowly around his neck. The echoes grew louder. Then, a sound broke through the silence, a whisper, soft at first, but unmistakably there. Sam. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, an ancient murmur that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. His heart lurched at the sound, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. His eyes darted around the room, but he could see nothing. No form, no figure, just the choking darkness that wrapped itself around his body like a cloak. Still, the voice came again, closer this time, like a breath against his ear. Sam, you can't escape it. He spun, his pulse quickening, his breath shallow and fast. There was nothing, no figure in the shadows, no eyes watching from the corners. But the voice, it was real. He could feel it, vibrating in his chest, in his very bones. It was like the room itself was speaking to him, the air alive with a presence he couldn't grasp. Yet he knew it was there, pressing against his senses. He stumbled backward, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the stone wall. It was rough beneath his fingers, like broken, jagged teeth of some ancient creature. His mind raced. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. It was all part of whatever madness had claimed this place. A hallucination, a trick of the mind. He had to escape, had to find a way out. He had no idea how he had gotten here or why he had ended up in this godforsaken place. But he had to get out. But his body refused to cooperate. The voice came again, this time louder, filled with a venomous edge. You were chosen, Sam. You opened the door. You came to us. There is no turning back now. His blood ran cold. The words echoed in his skull like a drumbeat, filling him with an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they had been planted there for this very moment. The door he had crossed earlier. That ancient structure. Whatever had opened it had already bound him to it. No. He forced his legs to move, ignoring the voice, ignoring the suffocating air around him. The corridor stretched endlessly before him, the stone walls warping and twisting as if they too were alive, shifting with his every step. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let this place consume him. He turned a corner and froze. Before him, bathed in the pale light of a single flickering candle, was a figure. It was tall, shrouded in darkness, and its face was obscured. But Sam knew, with an instinctual certainty that gnawed at him, that he was not meant to see its face. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. It merely stood there, watching him with an unnerving stillness. The silence was deafening. Sam's heart hammered against his ribcage. He couldn't tear his gaze away. The figure felt wrong, as if it were stitched together from the remnants of forgotten dreams, its form an impossible geometry of angles and shadows. As he took a hesitant step forward, the figure's form seemed to shift, a fluid motion that shouldn't have been possible. It twisted, and Sam was filled with the creeping sensation that it was not a single entity, but a multitude of things, each layer of its being twisting and contorting, each whispering a different language, a different reality. He took another step. The floor creaked beneath his weight, and the figure's head tilted, ever so slightly. The darkness seemed to stretch around it, feeding off the room, feeding off him. Sam could feel his stomach churn, his pulse pounding in his throat, his mind fraying at the edges. His legs shook, but he forced himself to take another step forward, drawn to the presence of the thing like a moth to flame. Then the voice came again, this time from the figure itself. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a roar, a crashing wave of sound that struck Sam's very soul. "You should never have come." The words tore through him, wrapping themselves around his heart, squeezing the breath from his lungs. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as though the air itself had thickened to a point of suffocation. The walls closed in, the shadows constricting, the figure growing larger, looming over him, its presence crushing him under its weight. Sam's body trembled with fear. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His mouth was dry, his limbs numb. His eyes burned as he stared at the figure, and in that moment, everything around him seemed to fade, the room falling away into a deeper darkness. A voice, his own this time, echoed within his mind. "Why am I here?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it took a step forward. Sam's mind screamed at him to run, to flee from this thing, but his body remained still, rooted in place, as if frozen by the very essence of the figure. He couldn't break free. His gaze was locked on it, as though he were caught in a trap of his own making, a prisoner of his own terror. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The darkness swirled in its wake, dissipating like smoke before a wind. The candlelight flickered and vanished, and the oppressive atmosphere that had once filled the room lifted, leaving only a silence so profound that it seemed to echo in the very fabric of the air. Sam stood there, motionless, his body cold with sweat, his mind reeling from the vision of the figure that had haunted him. But when he turned to leave, the whisper came again, a low hiss at the back of his mind, a reminder that the figure was still with him, somewhere. And no matter how far he ran, no matter how fast he moved, the thing that had been with him since the beginning was never truly gone. It had been waiting for him, and Sam had just begun to understand that this was not a place for escape. Chapter 9. The Hollow Path. The darkness lingered, heavy and suffocating, pressing in from every direction like the tight embrace of an unseen force. Sam's legs were weak, his knees trembling beneath him, but he forced himself forward. There was nowhere else to go but deeper into the gloom that seemed to stretch on endlessly before him. The shadows whispered, curling around him like a slow-moving tide, filling the silence with voices. Voices that seemed to emerge from the very walls, the very air itself. They spoke in fragmented sentences, half-formed thoughts that made no sense, yet each word felt like it was meant for him. "You are the one who called us. The door is not closed. We are all here." Each voice carried a weight of despair, 1,000 lost souls screaming in unison. They were everywhere and nowhere, drifting through the thick fog of Sam's mind like half-remembered nightmares. He pressed his palms against his ears, trying to block them out, but it did nothing. The voices grew louder, more insistent, until they were a maddening cacophony that seemed to pound against his skull. His thoughts swirled in chaos, but one truth echoed through the madness. cutting through everything else like a sharp knife. He was being hunted. He had always been hunted. The memories, fragmented and distant, began to resurface. Flashes of images, sounds, fleeting glimpses of faces he couldn't place. It was as though a door had been unlocked in his mind. A door that had been sealed shut for so long. And now the floodgates were open. But with each new memory came a new horror, a new realization that the very world he thought he knew was nothing more than an illusion. He had done this. He had brought it all on himself. The voices, the darkness, the entity that waited in the shadows. It was all a consequence of his choices, of a decision made long before he had even realized the consequences. The faintest sound reached his ears, a scraping, almost imperceptible, like something dragging across stone. A chill ran down his spine. It was too close, too immediate. He felt the pressure of unseen eyes upon him, felt the walls closing in again, not in the physical sense, but in a way that twisted his very perception of the space around him. The air thickened, and the temperature seemed to drop with every step he took. Then there was a shift. He stopped, frozen in place as the darkness before him seemed to stir. From the shadows, a shape emerged. It was a figure, tall and indistinct, its form a blur of edges and angles that twisted in ways unnatural, as though it were not quite real in the traditional sense. The air around it seemed to warp, bending light and sound until they became distorted, like the figure existed in a different dimension altogether. Sam's throat tightened. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to escape the growing terror that gnawed at his insides. But his body betrayed him, locked in place by an invisible force. His legs refused to obey, and his breath caught in his chest, shallow and ragged. The figure moved closer. The faint whispering grew louder, sharper, until it felt like it was vibrating in his very bones. There were words now, though they were twisted and indistinct, as though being spoken underwater. "You shouldn't have returned." Sam's heart lurched, the weight of the words sinking deep into his chest like a stone. Returned. He had never been here before. He would have remembered, but something deep inside him stirred, a flicker of recognition that was both comforting and terrifying, as if the figure knew him, as if it had always known him. The figure came closer, and the air grew colder still, its presence like a freezing fog that clung to his skin, seeping into his bones. Sam felt it now, not just the fear, but something more primal, something that made his entire body ache with the weight of it, the feeling of being watched, not just by the figure, but by something far greater, something far older. He wanted to speak, to ask what it wanted, but the words stuck in his throat. All that came out was a rasping breath, a strangled sound that echoed in the empty space between them. The figure didn't speak again, but it didn't need to. It was the way it moved, the way it twisted in on itself, bending and folding in ways that shouldn't have been possible, that told Sam everything he needed to know. The entity wasn't from here. It had never been from here. It was something that belonged to this place, but not in the way any human could understand. Sam took a step back, his mind screaming for him to move, to run. But the figure's presence rooted him to the spot, and just as his eyes flicked downward to find some way to escape, he saw it. The floor, which had once seemed solid and unyielding, was no longer what it appeared. It was shifting, breathing, as if the very ground beneath him was alive, pulsing with an energy he couldn't comprehend. The stones that had once made up the path before him had begun to twist, pulling themselves apart like the strands of some ancient, decaying web. The world was unraveling. He stumbled backward, but the figure's gaze followed him, unblinking, unwavering. Sam's mind began to break down further. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the floor itself was trying to pull him under. And then it spoke again. The hollow path. The words echoed around him, a low, guttural sound that seemed to emanate from the depths of the earth itself. The hollow path. Sam didn't understand what it meant, but somehow he knew that it was where he was, where he had always been. He turned, his feet dragging through the shifting ground beneath him, and he began to run. He ran, but the shadows grew longer. The air grew thicker. The whispering voices rose in a crescendo of madness. He ran, but there was no way out. The hallway stretched on and on, twisting and turning, and no matter how fast he moved, no matter how hard he pushed, it only seemed to pull him deeper. He could feel it now. The truth that he had been running from for so long. The hollow path was not a place. It was a journey. A path that had no end, no destination, only a continual descent into the abyss of his own making. The realization hit him like a wave crashing over the shore. He wasn't running towards something. He was running from something, from the truth that had been waiting for him all along. Chapter 9. The Hollow Path. Continued. Sam's breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning as the darkness around him seemed to swallow him whole. The hollow path twisted unnaturally, the walls stretching and shifting, warping like melted wax in a flame. He wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was dry, raw, and his voice was lost in the suffocating air, consumed by the weight of the unseen horrors pressing in on him from all sides. With every step, the ground beneath his feet pulsed, vibrating in a low hum that reverberated through his bones, like some ancient heart beating in the depths of the earth. The walls of the path seemed to close in, narrowing until they pressed against his shoulders, the space between them suffocating, claustrophobic. And yet, despite the impossibly small distance, the figure, the presence, remained just out of reach, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. You shouldn't have come back. The voice, now clear and resonant, echoed in his mind, filling it with a cold dread that turned his stomach. Sam didn't need to see the figure to feel it closing in on him. It was there. It had always been there. The truth. The truth of the hollow path, of the place he had walked into. A place that wasn't just some abandoned ruin, but something far more insidious. Something that had existed long before he'd ever stepped foot in it. Something that had been waiting for him, for this. As he stumbled forward, trying to outrun the overwhelming pressure, his mind flashed back to the moment he first set foot on this path. The night he had found the door, hidden away in the attic, covered in dust, tucked behind forgotten relics of a life that no longer felt like his own. The door had called to him, in a way that no door should. It had promised answers, promises of something long lost, long forgotten. But it had lied. The memories swirled back like a whirlwind, relentless and unkind. He remembered the first time he had entered the darkness, how everything had felt wrong from the start. The strange pull, the way the walls had seemed to breathe, how the air had thickened with each passing moment, and most of all, the feeling that something had been watching him from the very beginning, something that had known him, truly known him, in a way that made his skin crawl. His eyes darted to the walls as they stretched and curled like living things, their surfaces now covered in dark veins, pulsing faintly with a sickly glow. They seemed to have a life of their own, as if the path was alive, feeding on his fear, growing stronger with every step he took. The ground was shifting again, the stones beneath his feet now slick and uneven. The tunnel was becoming a maze, the walls narrowing even further, the oppressive atmosphere closing in with each breath he took. He couldn't see it, but he could feel the presence, like a heavy, suffocating hand pressing down on him, pushing him further into the unknown. "No! No, please," Sam whispered, the words slipping from his lips in desperation. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." The voice interrupted him, low and mocking, as though it had been waiting for him to speak. "You never know, do you?" The figure materialized then, its shape twisting in and out of existence like smoke caught in a windstorm. Its form was impossible to grasp, constantly shifting, an amalgamation of nightmares and shadows. It hovered just beyond his reach, its dark presence bleeding into the walls themselves. Sam could feel it now, not just the terror, but the suffocating weight of its hunger. This wasn't just some malevolent spirit. It was something far more ancient. A force that had existed long before human memory. A force that had been waiting for someone like him. "I didn't mean to open it," Sam stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of his terror. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I I just wanted to understand. To know what happened. You never understand, the voice rasped, a low growl that echoed through the very air around him. You are nothing but the echo. The path is always the same. Always. The shadows around him grew deeper, thickening into a solid mass, wrapping around him like chains. Sam tried to move, to break free, but his body was frozen, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. It was as if the very path itself had claimed him, pulling him into its depths. But then something unexpected happened. The darkness began to shift again. The oppressive weight of the air seemed to ease, just slightly, as if the pressure had lessened. For a fleeting moment, Sam felt a rush of hope, a feeling that he could escape this nightmare, that he could somehow break free from the grip of the path. But before he could act, the walls around him began to tremble, the earth beneath his feet cracking open like a wound that refused to heal. From the cracks, something began to crawl, something ancient, something not human. The shadows poured forth from the fractures in the ground, taking shape, becoming something more tangible, something real. Sam's breath caught in his throat as the form emerged fully from the earth, a mass of writhing darkness, like a serpent, but wrong. Its body distended, unnatural, a grotesque reflection of a creature that had never existed. Its eyes, black and endless, stared at him with an intensity that pierced through the very fabric of his mind. It was watching him, studying him, as if it could taste his fear. His heart pounded violently against his ribs as he stumbled backward, instinctively trying to flee from the thing before him. But it was no use. The hollow path was a trap, and he had walked willingly into it. Now he was caught in its endless cycle. The creature shifted forward, its tendrils of darkness curling around his legs, binding him in place. It spoke then, its voice a guttural rasp that reverberated through his very soul. The echo is not over. A loud crack sounded above him, like thunder, and for a brief moment, the walls around him parted, revealing a cavernous expanse beyond. The floor fell away beneath his feet, and Sam found himself tumbling down, deeper into the hollow path's heart. The air was thick with decay, the very ground beneath him alive with darkness, and he knew that there was no way back now. There was only the path, and the thing that had been waiting for him at its end. Chapter 10. The Echo's End. The descent seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness consuming him in its thick, unrelenting embrace. Sam's body collided with the cold, jagged ground with a sickening thud, and for a moment the world seemed to shift, tilting sideways, spinning in a dizzying spiral. His hands pressed into the rough stone beneath him, feeling the coldness seep into his skin, as though the very earth itself was trying to pull him into its bowels. He forced himself to stand, his legs shaking as he fought the urge to collapse, to let the darkness overtake him. There was something in the air now, an almost tangible heaviness that pressed against him from all sides, making it hard to breathe. The walls around him were slick with moisture, the air stinking of decay, of something long forgotten. The ground beneath his feet was soft, like wet earth, and yet it felt wrong, alive, as though it were breathing. Sam swallowed hard, his throat dry, the taste of fear and the remnants of a bitter past lingering on his tongue. He could hear the distant echoes of whispers, voices from somewhere deep within the labyrinth of the hollow path. They were faint at first, just murmurs at the edges of his consciousness, but soon the whispers grew louder until they were no longer just voices. They were feelings, sensations crawling under his skin, seeping into his bones. You should never have returned. The voice that had haunted him from the very beginning, cut through the dark, clear and mocking. Sam's heart clenched painfully in his chest as he turned toward the source. But there was nothing there, just the deep, oppressive blackness that stretched endlessly in every direction. What do you want from me? Sam's voice trembled, but he couldn't stop himself. It had been too long, too many days spent trapped in this nightmare to stay silent any longer. I didn't choose this. I didn't ask for any of this. The voice didn't answer him. Instead, the air around him seemed to shift, to vibrate, like the ground was shifting under his feet. Sam felt his stomach tighten, his breath quickening, as the whispers rose, louder now, as if the very walls of the hollow path were closing in on him. "You can't leave." Suddenly, the walls around him began to pulse, as if alive with the rhythm of some ancient heartbeat. The stone seemed to grow hotter, the very air thickening with a suffocating pressure that made his skin prickle. The ground beneath his feet trembled as a low, guttural growl resonated from the depths of the earth, sending a shockwave through his body. He tried to run, to push forward, but his legs felt like lead. The very air seemed to resist him, wrapping around him, pulling at him, as though it was trying to hold him in place. The walls began to shift once more, the stones bending and twisting, their surfaces rippling with a sickly dark light. Sam could feel them, watching him, waiting. Then, as if summoned by his thoughts, a figure began to emerge from the depths of the darkness. It was not human, nothing like anything he had seen before. Its form was tall, impossibly thin, with long, sinewy limbs that stretched out like shadows. Its skin was like blackened stone, cracked and weathered, with veins of molten red coursing beneath the surface. Its face was a twisted mask of despair, hollowed eyes staring into Sam's very soul. "You are the last one, the last to seek it." The voice that emanated from the figure was not the same as the whispers. It was deep, ancient, resonating with a power that made Sam's bones ache. "You've opened the door. Now, you must finish what was started." Sam stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest as the creature advanced, its every movement calculated, predatory. He tried to speak, to scream, but the words failed him. His breath caught in his throat as the figure raised one elongated hand, pointing directly at him. "You know what you did." The figure's voice was soft, almost gentle now, like a lover's whisper. But there was no kindness in it. "You opened the door to this place. You are its echo. The price must be paid." The words sent a chill through Sam's very core. He understood, at least in part, what the figure was saying. He had always known it, deep down. The truth that had been gnawing at him ever since he first stepped into the house, ever since he had opened the door. He had been the one to awaken this place, this curse, this hunger that had slumbered for so long. And now, the hollow path was calling for its due. He was trapped. There was no way out. "No!" Sam whispered, his voice shaking. "I didn't." "You cannot undo what has been done. The hollow path claims all who walk it. You have become part of it now." The creature's eyes glowed with an eerie light, and Sam could feel it. The pull of the path, the weight of the darkness that had followed him from the very beginning. He could feel his body begin to give way, his limbs trembling as if the very marrow in his bones was being drained away. The whispers swirled around him, their voices growing louder, overlapping, until they became a cacophony that threatened to tear apart his mind. The world around him began to shift again, the path bending and twisting like a living thing, growing and contracting, the walls closing in with crushing force. Sam's vision blurred, the darkness beginning to consume him whole. And then he saw it, the door he had opened. It was there, at the far end of the passage, standing tall and proud against the crushing blackness. It was a doorway to the past, to the thing that had brought him here. It was the final echo. The figure reached out, its long fingers grazing the air like a ghost, and the path seemed to part for a moment, revealing the door in its full, horrifying glory. Sam could feel the pull, the undeniable gravity of the door's presence. It was calling to him. He took a step forward, his legs moving without his consent, compelled by an invisible force. With every step, the whispers grew louder, more urgent, and the world around him seemed to dissolve into nothingness. There was no time, no space. There was only the door. And when his hand touched the cold, ancient wood, he felt a shock of recognition, a final, horrible understanding. He had opened it once before, and now it was time to finish what had been started. With a final, silent scream, Sam stepped through the door. This chapter deepens the horror and tension surrounding Sam's journey. revealing that he is not only a victim of the hollow path, but also intrinsically linked to it, responsible for the chain of events that brought him here. The chapter culminates in Sam confronting the truth of his role and the inescapable fate that awaits him. The hollow path, now fully realized, pulls him into its depths, closing the loop on his journey, and leaving the reader questioning what's next for Sam and whether he will ever truly escape.